Well, we're now joined by Keith Wilson, who's a lawyer who also represents members of the Convoy protests. Mr. Wilson, thank you for joining us again.
Thank you for having me.
So you are in Calgary right now, and as you said to me earlier, you are there with some of the protesters, among them Tamara Lich. I'm wondering what the reaction is from you and from the people you represent.
Well, I was in another meeting when the report initially came out, so they had a chance to digest it. And then when I came into the hotel room that I'm in right now, the leaders were all around. And there was this tremendous, painful look of sorrow and loss on their face, very similar to what, we experience when we have a loss of a loved one. And what they explained to me is that they feel this is a dark day for our country. It's a dark day because we've always been proud of our respect for rights and freedoms, for human rights, for dialogue, political dissent. And this decision from Mr. Rouleau says that the threshold is of what occurred in Ottawa is enough to bring in the Emergencies Act and take rights from people to freeze bank accounts, personal business bank accounts. So they're quite concerned that we've taken a turn to more of an authoritarian country as opposed to the true north, strong and free.
I want to break that up a little bit and begin with the fact that, when you go through this report, Justice Rouleau does say that there were many peaceful protesters a part of the movement. In fact, he says that all governments should have done a better job of acknowledging that the majority of people were just exercising their fundamental and democratic rights and should have been more clear, drawing a line of distinction between peaceful protesters and those who are not. Is that not at least encouraging to you?
Well, yes, but it still signals that, in the past, remember, we've only used this type of power where we suspend civil liberties, where we allow the government to seize property, in this case, bank accounts and other things, without the due process of law, when we've been in an acute existential situation like World War I, World War II, and the FLQ crisis. So we've completely established a new bar, and not only a new bar, but new powers, because back then, we didn't have digital banking and everybody had cash and so on. So no, it doesn't give comfort. I think there's international implications to this. I think this decision today, respectfully, tarnishes Canada's image as a country that in the past has been this hallmark, this fresh air of freedom and respect for individuals and diversity of views and dialogue. So I take no comfort in any aspect of the report, to be candid with you.
Justice Rouleau also makes a distinction between peaceful protesters and what he says was happening on Parliament Hill. Again, acknowledging that many people had come out to be peaceful, but there were other elements amongst the protesters. And he basically says that he doesn't accept the fact that the whole protest was a peaceful action.
Well, then he's redefining the English language, because what we know is the crime statistics were down. We know that there was no bombings, there was no fires, there was no windows broken. There was an absence of criminality. There was an absence of violence. That was the sworn testimony from the OPP, from the RCMP, from the Ottawa City Police, from CSIS, and so on. So, see, that's what's concerning here, is that we're using new terms to define violence. It wasn't actual violence. It was felt or perceived violence. So, I'm not suggesting, nor any of my clients, that it would have been unreasonable for the government to take steps. And I was always baffled why they didn't use some of their existing powers early. I was always baffled as to why no one applied for an injunction to have them leave. We had an injunction against horns, and we had an injunction against something else, but nobody ever applied, no government authority ever applied for an injunction to have them leave. I was always baffled by that, and I testified to that during the inquiry. So I think it comes back to the high-level point that we can get into the minutiae on these various points, but at the end of the day, the nature of civil disobedience that we saw has now been deemed to be sufficient to trigger these powers that have only been triggered in the past in World War existential situations of national security. And I think it's a chilling effect. It fundamentally changes the ability of not just this government, of any other government. That's what I think we've got to be careful about. We're all on teams, right? You're either conservative or liberal or left or right. Any government can use these powers now in a way that was not constrained prior to today.
2020 hindsight, I'm wondering, Mr. Wilson, would you have advised for things to be done differently than they were from the protesters?
No, I've reflected on that many times. As you can imagine, there was a very challenging environment. There was a lot of people with different views. My job, among other things, was to try and achieve Tamara's wishes, which was to always keep the protest peaceful, always keep it as respectful as possible, to make sure there was no violence, no vandalism, those sorts of things. There was no burning of churches or buildings or anything like that. It was these people had the right to have representation as they exercised their charter right of protests and lawful assembly. At no time, each of the police officials that we walked through, and I think it was even Lamenti as well, were any of the legal triggers met to declare this an unlawful assembly, even though everybody uses this phrase unlawful assembly, and they all agreed they weren't. They didn't meet the requirements. The Riot Act wasn't read under the criminal code. I could go on. So all in all, I think what should have happened was someone in the federal government should have said, hey, let's sit down and talk to these people. Let's hear them out. They didn't have to agree with the protesters, but the Canadian way to do things is have a civil discourse, see where we can agree, to on a way of a dialogue to move forward, to resolve grievances. And now, as a government, you don't have to work that hard anymore. You can ignore those who disagree with you, and if they get too boisterous and they start protesting, well, now you can seize their bank accounts and freeze their business accounts as well. And I think that's what's so dangerous about what happened today.
So how do you answer then, in the Rouleau report, the justice pointing out to the fact that he didn't think there would have been opportunity to negotiate with anyone because the protest itself was so decentralized?
Well, I mean, I've addressed this many times, including in my testimony. The proof is in the pudding. And what I mean by that is Tamara Leach and the board and the other road captains had negotiated over a number of days, and I was involved in that with the mayor, and leading into the weekend before the invocation. And on the Monday morning, the same day, the same afternoon, February 14th, that the Emergencies Act was invoked, they had shown their ability to clear out a number of city blocks. Over 100 protest vehicles moved, 23 up to Wellington, the rest out to the base camps, and some of them people went home. So I think they demonstrated their ability to have moral suasion and get the cooperation of the protesters. The only reason that was stopped was because the police put a stop to it, and that was the testimony under oath at the inquiry. So I think, and it worked. The civil discussion worked at Windsor. It worked at Coutts. That's why those borders were opened over the weekend. But there was this absolute adamance on part of the federal government to have no dialogue whatsoever, even though they had my cell number, even though they knew they could reach out to the mayor. They had my email address. They had Tamara's email address. They had her phone number. So it's disappointing. I hope that, we've got it. Canadians need to decide whether they think this was a good thing, and they need to voice their views to their elected officials, and political parties need to decide what their position is. Because if enough Canadians say, no, I don't think this is right, what's happened here, and it's not a reflective of my Canadian values, then a future government can amend the Emergencies Act to put in truly stringent thresholds so that it can't be used to simply quell protests and lawful dissent.
Keith Wilson, thank you for the time today.
Thank you very much.